You were told a name was just a label. In the Viking world, that was a lie. A name could decide your fate before you ever spoke. And once it did, there was almost no way out. A name could save you, or it could mark you so completely that escape became impossible. In the Viking world, a name was not a decoration. It was a warning. It told others what to expect from you and what you were expected to become. Long before a blade was drawn, the name had already decided how the room would turn when you entered it. Most people think Viking names were just labels. Strong sounds for strong people. Ragnar, Ivar, Bjorn. Simple, brutal. But that belief is comfortable, and it is wrong. Because names were never neutral. They were chosen to press a person into shape. A child was not named for who they were. They were named for what the family needed them to be. Take Ragnar. People hear it and imagine glory. But the root is judgment, counsel, authority, a name that weighs heavy. To carry it was to be watched more closely, measured more harshly. A Ragnar could not fail quietly. His name would not allow it. And this is where the pressure began. A Viking child grew up hearing their name spoken in expectations. At the fire, at the table, in public gatherings where silence mattered more than praise. Each time the name was used, it was a reminder of the role assigned before the child could resist. But this wasn't the worst part. Names were also memory traps. The Vikings believed that to name a child after the dead was to pull something forward. Not a soul, not a ghost, but a pattern, a temperament, a destiny already tested. If a grandfather named Bjorn had been fierce, the child Bjorn would be watched for the same fire, and if it did not appear, people noticed. Silence followed, and silence was dangerous. This is where the story turns. Nicknames mattered more than given names, and nicknames were not chosen by the self. They were earned or imposed. Eric the Red, Ivar the Boneless, Harold Fairhair. These were not compliments, they were summaries. Red for blood or temper or exile. Boneless not for weakness, but for something unsettling that made people uneasy to explain. Fairhair for a vow that became legend because it was visible. Once a nickname stuck, it replaced the person. You could change your behavior. You could leave. You could cross the sea. But the name traveled faster than you did. It arrived first, shaping how people would treat you before you spoke. What followed was quieter and worse. Some names were never meant to be spoken loudly. Women's names carried a different weight. Astrid, Sigrid, Freydis. Names tied to beauty, victory, or the divine. But they were also boundaries. A woman named for a goddess was expected to reflect control, not freedom. Strength, but contained. Power, but only in ways that preserved order. When women stepped outside that shape, the stories changed around them. Their names became warnings instead of honors. Freydis is remembered not for what she endured, but for what made others uncomfortable. Her name tied her to a goddess of fertility and war, and that contradiction was never forgiven. The name made her visible, and visibility was not safety. But the system was consistent. Names also controlled who belonged. A Viking did not have a family name in the modern sense. You were someone's son, someone's daughter. Eriksson, Olaf's daughter. Your identity was temporary, tied to a living chain. If the chain broke, so did your standing. Outlaws lost more than land. They lost names. To be declared outside the law meant your name could no longer be spoken with protection. Anyone could harm you. Anyone could refuse you shelter. You were alive, but socially erased. The name remained, but it no longer worked. And this is where fear lived, because the worst punishment was not death. It was being remembered wrong, or not at all. Vikings believed that fame was a form of survival. To be spoken of after death was to resist disappearance. Names were carved into stone, whispered in poems, bound into sagas that decided who mattered. But sagas were edited by power. Names could be reshaped after you were gone. A brave act could be reframed as recklessness. A careful choice could be renamed cowardice. And once the story fixed the name, there was no appeal. Even the gods were not safe from this. Odin means fury, not wisdom, not kindness, fury. A reminder that knowledge came at a cost, and the cost was instability. To name a child after Odin was to invite unpredictability into the household. Some families did it anyway, and then watched closely, waiting to see if the price would be paid. Thor means thunder, noise, impact, a force that arrives and leaves damage behind. Children named Thor were expected to be obvious, loud, decisive. If they were quiet, something felt wrong. Loki's name meant knots, entanglement. The problem you could not pull apart without breaking the rope. And no one named their child Loki lightly, because some names were invitations. But this wasn't the deepest layer. Names were also believed to be vulnerable. To know someone's true name was to have leverage. This is why nicknames flourished. They distracted, they misdirected. They gave enemies something to grab that wasn't the core. Runes were carved not just as writing, but as restraint. A name cut into wood or stone could be bound, protected, or cursed. The same letters could bless or rot, depending on who carved them and why. This belief didn't vanish with time. When Christianity spread north, the change in names was one of the first signs of surrender. Old gods disappeared from naming. Biblical names entered quietly, not as replacements but as insurance. A double identity, pagan at home, Christian in public. A new name meant a new set of rules watching you, and yet the old system never fully died. Even today, the Viking names that survive do so because they carried weight. Not because they were common, but because they were heavy enough to endure being repeated. And this leads to the uncomfortable truth. Names mattered because they made people predictable. Once you were named, others decided what you were capable of, what you were allowed to fear, what kind of ending suited you. The name narrowed the path long before the first step was taken. Freedom existed, but it was expensive. To break away from a name meant leaving witnesses behind, leaving memory, leaving protection. It meant becoming unknown. And in a world that watched closely, the unknown was hunted. So most people didn't resist. They lived into the sound they were given. They became the story their name promised, because the alternative was isolation. And isolation was worse than fate. By the time the sagas were written, the names had already won. They survived. The people did not. And if this feels distant, if it feels like a relic of a violent past, consider this quietly. You still carry a name. It still arrives before you do. It still shapes what people expect and what they forgive. The Vikings did not invent this. They simply refused to pretend it was harmless. They knew a name could follow you into darkness, and they chose them accordingly.